Now, on post-pandemic industrial policy, jobs, growth, sustainability, and resilience, organized by the Committee for Development Policy, by UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, and by UNIDO. The theme of today's webinar was already gaining attention in policy circles before the pandemic. This reflects the ongoing changes in our concept of industry. Those changes have been driven in large part by two factors. First, the imperative of sustainability, and above all, the urgency of addressing the climate crisis. Several of the major subsectors of industry are very energy intensive, and given the need to decarbonize, the way we think about industrialization has itself undergone a transformation. Second, the manufacturing sector, which is the traditional focus of industrial policy, has become increasingly dependent on services, research and development, logistics, product design, marketing. And these services are providing a rising share of the value generated by industrial activities. The competitiveness of a nation's manufacturing will increasingly depend on the availability of a wide range of good services at a reasonable cost. But our economies of the future must not only be low carbon or carbon neutral, they must also be dramatically more resource efficient. Shifting to circularity in production and consumption will be an important part of this necessary change, and this will require a large-scale industrial transformation in the ways energy and goods are produced and consumed, and in the development of new business models, skills, and cross-sectoral collaboration. On top of all of this, the severity of the impacts of COVID-19 and the increasingly visible climate-related disasters have generated a sense that there will be no better opportunity in the crisis than this one to move forward to sustainable, equitable economies and to meet the SDGs. Despite the setbacks that the crisis has caused, we do have the means to mobilize towards the SDGs. Industrial policy is one of these means, but it will not be the industrial policy we are used to. So what should post-pandemic industrial policy for the 21st century look like? We're fortunate to have today a stellar panel with renowned experts on industrial policy and professionals who are engaged in climate change and energy policy, among other areas. 5 of our participants are members of the Committee for Development Policy, one of the advisory bodies of the United Nations Economic and Social Council. José Antonio Ocampo is the chair of the Committee for Development Policy. He's a professor of professional practice in international and public affairs at the School of International Public Affairs in Columbia University. He's also a former Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs in the UN. Ha-Joon Chang is a member of the committee and professor of political economy of development at Cambridge University. Arunabha Ghosh is Chief Executive Officer of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water in Delhi, India. Kori Udovički is head of the Center for Advanced Economic Studies in Belgrade. In addition to the CDP members, we're joined on the panel by Smeeeta Fokeer, Research and Industrial Policy Officer at UNIDO, the UN agency dedicated to promoting and accelerating inclusive and sustainable industrial development. Last, but certainly not least, our discussion today will be moderated by Adriana Abdenur, a member of the Committee of Development Policy and Executive Director of Plataforma Cipó, Brazil, an independent women-led policy institute focusing on climate, governance, and peace building in the Global South. So without further ado, I hand over to Adriana to begin our panel discussion. Adriana?
Thank you very much, Elliott. Welcome, everybody. We have quite a range of colleagues attending the event. And I wanted to say, first of all, that as Elliott has already mentioned, industrial policy discussions are really making a comeback, but we have yet to see whether putting into practice a new type of industrial policy will also come back center stage. I just returned from COP26 in Glasgow, and it struck me in light of the preparation for this debate how frequently I heard in the events there the term industrial policy, but also calls for new approaches, including the idea that has also been promoted by, for instance, UNEP, of a green industrial policy that would follow in some ways the same state-driven structural change approach, but also accelerating the shift towards carbon-intensive economic industrial sectors towards a more green and more resilient global economy. But we also have to deal with a backdrop that has been exacerbated by the pandemic of deepening socioeconomic inequalities that require, as we all know, governance modalities that are more inclusive, including with respect to gender, race, and geography, as well as rapidly expanding poverty in many parts of the global South. And sometimes these are aspects that have not been taken into account adequately in past discussions of industrial policy. So given that sometimes, and here in our region in Latin America, this is certainly the case, industrial policy has sometimes gotten a bad rap for picking champions and supposedly for exacerbating certain types of inequality. How do we think forward for new models, new approaches that will reach the goals that Elliott has set forth? Let me just mention some ground rules for our discussion. First of all, we're going to start with a discussion among the panelists, and we're going to try to keep the latter part of the meeting for a few questions from the floor. So please write your questions in the Q&A field, or if you're watching us from Facebook, in the comment section. And a quick reminder that our meeting is being recorded. Hopefully it will be made available afterwards for a broader public. We're going to have 5 very quick rounds, each based on a guiding questions. And I will ask my colleagues to be brief within their responses, be very succinct so that we can have a more interactive final part of the discussion later on. So let me start with the initial question, which is, what needs to be fundamentally different in post-pandemic industrial policy so as to reconcile ecological, social, and economic ambitions? And here I also invite the panelists to consider impacts or the role of industrial policy in addressing inequalities. We're going to start with José Antonio Ocampo, which, as Elliott has already mentioned, is chair of the CDP, and he has written very extensively on development in general. He has 2 recent chapters in an Oxford University Press on industrial policy, focusing on macroeconomics and structural change, as well as industrial policy in Latin America. So José Antonio, if you can keep your response to 3 minutes, we can then gather some initial responses from the remaining panelists. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Adriana. Well, nice to be with all of the CDP colleagues, including you, of course, Adriana, and also with Elliott and DESA, and of course with UNIDO. I think the most important part of your answer is that the environmental issues have to be central to the going forward, which means, first of all, the issue that Elliott already raised about how to manage climate change implications, which of course mean also a technological revolution in several areas, in order to be able to manage the new energy productions. Let's say some have already been developed, like solar and wind energy, but for example, hydrogen is still in the process, or carbon sequestration is still an unfinished business. So that's one point. For developing countries also is participating in that technological revolution, but also good mechanisms to transfer technology to all the sectors involved. But also, let me also emphasize, and very much from a Latin American perspective, or you can say a tropical perspective, the issue of biodiversity. Biodiversity loss is, you can say, even worse than climate change. I mean, according to all the estimates, we have lost about 80% of the of animal and vegetable varieties. So how to avoid and to reconstruct biodiversity has to be a major issue, which of course means protecting the natural forests that we have, notably the Amazon in our continent, the Americas, but also doing a much better management of biodiversity going forward. Now, your last issue, which is inclusiveness, I think is a different issue, but I think industrial policy does have to have a special mechanism to support the formalization of firms and workers, which is a major issue in most developing countries, but also the capacity to finance and transfer technology to micro and small firms, which has to be a very important ingredient of industrial policy, even if it doesn't mean, let's say, technological revolution in the correct sense of the term. Okay, I stop here.
Thank you very much. And I'm glad that you brought up the issue of biodiversity, which in the past was pretty much neglected by discussions of industrial policy. On inclusiveness, I'm also eager to hear from other colleagues, because for instance, here in Brazil, we know that small and medium firms are often led by women and Black or indigenous people, and they have been complaining that they were left out of past industrial policy models. So it would be interesting for us to brainstorm more. So I'll turn to my colleague, Arunabha Ghosh, who I ran into and had dinner with at COP in Glasgow, and who has been very deeply engaged in climate and energy policy in India as well as globally. He has ongoing research and advocacy on the transition to clean energy and sustainable manufacturing, including very interesting new proposals about hydrogen. So Arunabha, if you can resume your answer to 3 minutes, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. And first of all, let me thank UNCDP, UNDESA, UNIDO, all for coming together and creating this to have this conversation. It's particularly exciting having this conversation a few days after 6 has ended, because now is where work begins. I just want to put forward 3 simple propositions, which I hope will also address your issue, Adriana, about inclusiveness. The proposition is that the future is likely to be more decentralized, more digitized, and more decarbonized. Now, how can we have industrial policy or green industrial policy that fits into a framework, or rather even shapes that future with agency? Let's take the first theme, right? Decentralized. What was industrial policy of the sort of the 1960s, 70s, 80s? It was that you'll get economies of scale, especially in developing countries, with much larger scale of manufacturing, drawing down on costs and grabbing market shares. Now, increasingly, we can see that industrial value add does not just come from cost economics, but from the specialization that comes in different parts of that supply chain. And the more we can design industrial policy that taps into those specializations through smaller decentralized production processes and production centers, we can weave ourselves as developing countries into a much larger supply chain. Which brings me to the digitalized part of the future. Increasingly, as we move into a lower carbon, more biodiversity friendly, more nature friendly industrial policy, we will need to establish.
It seems that the sound has been cut off.
It's frozen.
I think it's Arunabha's connection, Adriana. I'll try to.
It might be the connection. Okay, maybe what we can do is we can move to Kori and then come back to Arunabha once his connection is reestablished. So Kori Udovički, she brings a very broad set of experiences to this debate, as well as extensive experience in public administration. And in fact, the organization that she leads has very recent work on issues on the role of enterprises in the 2030 agenda, inequalities, and the circular economy. So Kori, it's a pleasure to hear your succinct answer to our guiding question. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. Hello, it is really my pleasure to have this opportunity to speak with all of you and this audience. what I would like to emphasize is if we start, and I think that's how we are approaching the question of or the concept of industrial policy as willingly or with deliberate intervention affecting production structures, that I think for us to succeed in the challenges that we have right now, we need to introduce more the question of affecting consumption. Industrial policy as a concept and the way, for example, climate mitigation has been approached, analyzed, thought about, are too focused on the locus of production. Who are the emitters of carbon is always the question. But the real question is, who are the consumers of carbon? By focusing on which has, of course, its reasons and advantages, focusing on pricing carbon through, for example, cap and trading, we leave off the hook the question that production can be outsourced, and therefore consumption of carbon continues unchanged. The question that the responsibility for emissions already accumulated actually lies with the developed countries primarily. Okay, some are now catching up fast, emerging economies. But again, by focusing on the emission in emerging economies, we leave off the hook, for example, 30% of emissions in the United States, which is what, for example, goes into transportation there, whereas in the rest of the world, that's much lower. So I think it is a very important conceptual broadening and change in the way we measure and we approach emissions. We also, by approaching, I'm using emissions only as an example, because as Jose Antonio already mentioned, the biodiversity challenge is even greater. Resources, all resources, natural resources are being put to complete stress. The only way we are going to really change what we do is by actually thinking about what the value and of what we consume truly is, and what the costs of what we consume truly are. And the distribution is automatic. And let me just mention, to be maybe more persuasive, my experience in government when, you know, in the heights of neoclassical thinking, where the focus was only on getting prices right. As a Minister of Energy, I tried to think of other ways to resolve the problems of the energy sector in my country other than raising prices. But it wasn't on the table. The international development community was adamant that it is the price that has to go up. And indeed, I instantly became the most unpopular minister in the government, but already by the year's end, it was evident how fundamentally changed the balance of the energy system was once prices were raised. Of course, that requires then intervention to protect the most affected, the poorest, and those with difficulties to other possibilities for heating and so on. And all of that was in fact addressed. And yet, when we speak of environmental challenges, we somehow focus on introducing technology, on changing production structures, address all the elements that need to come into place separately, instead of focusing on what one could consider the baton of the director that coordinates the response. So, so much for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kori, for bringing attention to this other complementary side of the problem, which is that of consumption. Let's try Arunabha again. I think he has fixed the connection problem. Arunabha, the floor is yours.
There had to be a glitch. So, I am happy to take the fall for the team. I hope you can hear me. I know I had already maybe used up 2 minutes. I'll just use up 1 more minute. I was on my second point, which is that the digital technologies actually allow us now to decentralize the production, but also to demonstrate and authenticate the kind of new industrial processes that are happening in a much more democratized way. Therefore comes the decarbonized production. So just one number I'll throw out there. Adriana, you talked about small, medium enterprises in Brazil, right? India has 63 million of them. At CW, we estimated that using distributed clean energy to drive income generating activities in rural areas, such as food processing, small textile units, etc., is a $53 billion opportunity. So this is not large, mega, are literally millions of such entrepreneurs who then can have tens of millions of micro entrepreneurs deriving value from this decentralized, digitized, and decarbonized production process, which is literally tens of billions of dollars of investment opportunity in just one country.
Thank you very much, Arunabha. It's amazing to think about the scale, but also the opportunities that these parts of the domestic markets represent. We're now going to turn to Ha-Joon Chang. Many of you already know his work. He's the author of some best-selling works, including Kicking Away the Ladder. And he also has some recent articles, which we also recommend. They include Industrial Policy in the 21st Century in Development and Change. And he's also the co-editor of the recently published Oxford Handbook on Industrial Policy, which gets into many of these different aspects of the debate. So Ha-Joon Chang, we're eager to hear your response.
Thank you, Adriana. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this exciting event. Yeah, I would like to start by saying, yes, I mean, the times have changed, the climate change actions have become more urgent, new technologies, some by necessity, like the need for climate action and adaptation, some by the progress of technologies themselves, like artificial intelligence and so on. These are all creating kind of new challenges and possibilities. There have been changes in global economic governance system, broadly speaking, reduction in policy space, although I emphasize that it's not completely gone, and there's a lot of room for innovative, imaginative policies, extension of and concentration of global value chains. So there are all these new challenges, and naturally we have to redesign our policies to suit these changing times, while also campaigning to reform what can be reformed. There has to be a reform of the WTO and other global trading agreements to create the more policy space for developing countries, especially LDCs and so on. But in thinking about this, first of all, I would like to argue that we shouldn't forget some of the fundamental principles that have been behind all the past industrial policy efforts, especially the successful ones. So the principle of infant industry, the need for policy space, linkages, the need to invest in the building productive capabilities, not just that hoping that policy space and protection will somehow create the new enterprises and industries. So I think we shouldn't forget this, and also that we need to be careful in declaring some changes unprecedented and unique. I mean, people that often talk as if automation is something new. No, I mean that the history of capitalism has been about automation. So we need to figure out exactly what is new. Yeah, what is new this time is that the white collar workers are going to be replaced. This is why there is so much worry about that disappearing jobs. These are people who used to tell blue collar workers, that just accept your fate, don't be against progress. now that their jobs that are being threatened, they are worried, but it's not as if that automation never existed. Global value chains that had already existed and played a very important role in the economic development of countries like South Korea and Taiwan in the 1960s and 70s. I mean, these countries started their industrialization being the lowest possible kind of subcontractors for American companies running global value chains in, I don't know, trainer shoes, stuffed toys, garments, and so on, the kind of things that Bangladesh has been doing successfully. So the challenge is to figure out how the expansion and the changes in the global value chains have changed the possibilities and challenges for developing countries to join the global value chain, climb up the chain, and eventually to create their own chains like Korea and Taiwan have done. Yeah? So that's the interesting question. So I think that basically we need to, while fully kind of understanding and embracing these new challenges, we should not kind of get overly excited about these being unique and new and so on, and remember the old principles. So, given this, I think that I mean, people have already said these things, but the environmental sustainability requires developing new technologies, technology transfer. It also creates the opportunities for leapfrogging for some developing countries, but it also makes technological catching up more difficult for some countries, because now the most defining feature of this cycle of technological change is not automation, but technological fusion. Yeah? I mean, Elliott has already talked about fusion between manufacturing and services. The agriculture is increasingly mechanized, automated. So when the technologies cross over, I mean, if you have low technological capabilities, it becomes even more difficult to learn these technologies, because in the old days, if you want to make cars, you learn mechanical technologies. Now, half of what the car companies do is electronics. You also need to learn electronics. Yeah? So these are creating challenges and opportunities. But I think I would finish by saying that, like Adriana has pointed out, the industrial policy, if you're not careful, can become very exclusive. Because it's in a way that kind of structural trickle down theory. You focus on certain key sectors. They do well. They create linkages. They pull up everyone together. So if you are not careful and develop industrial policies that are at least designed to be broad-based, like it was in countries like Korea and Taiwan, or at least increase the social monitoring of this process, it can become very exclusive, corrupt, and in this environment of heightened inequality, it can be a huge problem. And in incorporating broader social interest, I would like to finally point out that in this post-pandemic area, we really need to try to incorporate the industrial policy with broader policies about the reproductive economy or the care economy. We have seen how important that sector is, how essential that sector is in the sustaining society, and that we have to incorporate that dimension. I mean, I'm not saying that it's got to be part of industrial policy, but we have to think more broadly to incorporate that dimension in our thinking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ha-Joon, especially for bringing up the dangers of a trickle-down logic, which sometimes has been applied, of course, not in so much in the successful cases, but we also have to remember that different countries and societies are experiencing these very broad changes, such as new technologies or newish technologies, integrated technologies, or the restructuring of supply chains in very different ways. So a one-size-fits-all approach has to be avoided, and we have to understand here in Brazil, for instance, the agricultural sector, export-oriented agriculture, has come to really dominate the economy and also politically. So there's a bit of a competition with industrial policy thinking there. But in a country like East Timor, Timor-Leste, which I follow through the committee, it's a very different experience of these broad changes. So how do we move forward, tailoring these discussions to particular middle-income countries or least developed countries? Thank you. And finally, but not least, we'll turn to Smeeeta Fokeer. She's responsible at UNIDO for project development and implementation in sustainable industrial policies, as well as a very vocal advocate of sustainable industrialization. So Smeeeta, we're lucky to have you here. We cannot hear you.
Smeeeta, you're on mute.
Okay.
Sorry, thank you. So I think fellow panelists here have already covered a lot of what the new industrial policy should be looking like. What I would probably help to bring in is the perspective of countries' request that we receive. So there has definitely been an evolution in industrial policy, right? We all know it, not just in how it's done, but the focus area of it. So as it's been mentioned, in the past, we had the very macroeconomic policies, we had the structural change of the economy, of the industry itself. Then came Agenda 21, and we got the environmental side of it. I have to say that it took 20 years for the environmental side, at least, of contribution from industrial policy to the environment to be there, to make make an impact. But I have to say that while we do see environmental aspects in industrial policies of developed industrialized countries, we still have a long way to go when it comes to developing countries. And then, okay, so we are making progress on the environment side. Slow, but it's happening. Then came the pandemic, right? Which has highlighted so much the fragility of the system that we've built, the industrialization issues, the vulnerability of the globalized world, that how everything crumbled from one day to the other. So what we are seeing now is that countries are requesting to have more resilience in that. They are looking at increasing their own productive capacities locally, especially for items which they deem critical. They do recognize the rapid adoption of digital technologies and are investing in the digital infrastructure, but and the foundational capabilities that they would need. But the main change in attitude that I think is very obvious, very prominent, is they want to address this question of inequalities. They want to address inclusiveness, that bring in that notion of leaving no one behind, right? I think in the next few years, we will be spending some time reflecting on what this means exactly. beyond general poverty reduction, job creation? Does it mean gender equality? Does it mean youth unemployment? Does it mean formalization of the informal sector? What else, and what policies we need to improve these, right? And also the SDGs have shown us that these goals we're trying to address through policies that are all very interlinked. So going forward, we need to get policymakers to assess the trade-offs of different goals and find ways to buffer these, because there are ways to mitigate the impact of progressive policies, I would say. So yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Smeeeta. And it seems from your remarks as well that we all have a general sense of how important some of these dimensions are to rethinking industrial policy, but they remain somewhat underspecified, especially with respect to how they can be operationalized. For instance, gender industrial policy, or new technologies in industrial policy. So there's a lot of work, maybe even for our committee next year. I would like to ask Elliott if he has any follow-up questions to make before we move on to round 2.
Thank you very much, Adriana. We got off to an excellent start. I have questions that could occupy us for the rest of the period. But what I hear coming out of every one of the interventions is the following, and please correct me if I'm wrong. Jose Antonio started off with inclusiveness, saying that we have to have industrial policy that with mechanisms to help formalize small firms and workers and transfer technologies to micro, small and medium enterprises. Arunabha, you spoke about small decentralized production and the tremendous amount of value that could be generated by that kind of decentralized but digitalized production. Only with that can you get to the kind of decarbonization that we're looking for. We heard from Ha-Joon that we have to be careful that industrial policy is broad-based and accessible to avoid that it becomes exclusionary. And we also heard that the typical approach of industrial policy aiming at scale is perhaps no longer the answer. So the question that I would put up there now is, if we're talking about digitalization and decentralization and a mechanism for ensuring technology transfer reaching to the small scale enterprise, and that has to be the backbone of industrial policy, can there be a single industrial policy? And Adriana, that comes back to your question of a tailored industrial policy. Do we need to have a menu of options that will serve the needs of different types, different actors in the economy? And what about industrial policy through the provision of services, making it possible, for example, for the small scale enterprise to absorb digital technologies without which they can't be competitive? So a different approach, a choice, a menu of options of industrial policies, many of which are in fact the provision of services. Does that make sense as industrial policy?
Thank you, Elliott. That's an excellent question. Would anybody on the panel like to offer a very succinct 1-minute answer so that we can then move on to the next round? Well, we're also going to be addressing parts of this question. Ha-Joon, I see your hand up. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, no. Basically, I want to make 2 points. One is it very much depends on the industry. So if you are into making cars, there's no way you can be competitive without being able to make 500,000 cars at the moment. Yeah, it might change in the future. So it depends on the industry. But secondly, there are other ways of making it more inclusive rather than directly focusing on SMEs. Yeah, I mean the benefits to the SME could be more indirect in the form of subcontracting or tax and redistribution. So we have to be imaginative, but because in some industries there's no way you can do it with SMEs, and in those industries you have to think of these other ways to create linkages, transfer income and so on. And finally, as a quick footnote, yes, actually countries have provided productive services through public entity. I mean, Taiwan, it has a lot of SMEs in the electronic sector, And the Chinese government had this the institute, which essentially provided subsidized technological consulting services to these SMEs. I mean, the German local government, the land governments, that have Fraunhofer schemes and all the other ways of helping SMEs with the technology consulting. So yes, I mean that these have been done and should be done more actively.
Thank you, Ha-Joon. Would anybody else? Maybe we can take one more and then I'll pose the second guiding question. Smeeeta, please. I think you're still on mute.
I'm sorry about this. I think it's a very, very interesting topic that you brought up. Indeed, we have seen it in many in many developing countries where we have pockets of excellence for which, especially in MSMEs, where they are providing very high value services, manufacturing related services for high value chains in technology sectors. So they are getting involved in the R&D, they are getting involved in the marketing, and as we know through the SMILE curve, that those are the high value added part of the value chain, right? So definitely provision of manufacturing related services is definitely one way that developing countries should be looking into developing their industrial policies, yes.
Thank you, Smeeeta. That's actually a perfect bridge to our next guiding question, which is, how can developing countries in particular use industrial policy to leverage the opportunities of the current scenario and position themselves competitively on global markets while ensuring climate resilience, diversification, and I'll add to that inclusiveness? Let's start again with José Antonio, please.
Well, thank you very much. Actually, based on your question, but also on some of the other comments, I wanted to perhaps to emphasize, first of all, that the issue of investment in science and technology is essential, as a major instrument for industrial policy, as well as financing, which relates to the work several of us are doing on development banks. National development banks, which, by the way, is also a topic that is back in the agenda. We see even the World Bank talking about, national development banks. I of course, once pointed out in the World Bank that were against national development banks. That I remember saying, like 15 years ago, I like development banks, including the World Bank. Because somehow they forgot that they were also a development bank. Anyway, development banking is also back in the agenda. And what are the instruments in terms of different elements like financing, credit, capital funds, including venture funds, as well as guarantees, and how you mix them in each specific context is very important. But I wanted to add a couple of things that I find very important. Nobody, I mean, in a sense, they relate to my point on biodiversity, but it has broader issues also for climate change, which is the issue of primary sectors, agriculture and mining, and what that implies in terms of climate change and biodiversity. Certainly biodiversity. For example, in Latin America, one of the major challenges is stopping deforestation altogether, actually reversing it, through adaptive policy of reforestation. That's one very important point. It has to do implication for climate change, because after all, that's our major contribution to climate change. But it also has to biodiversity as an issue. But also cattle raising. cattle raising is a very important issue. First of all, because of methane emissions, but also deforestation. And what are we going to do with that, given in the countries that have extensive cattle raising as a major issue, which relates in turn to other technological changes that have to be taking place in mining and in mining processing, which is industrial activity, but which does require new technologies, including, for example, hydrogen technologies in some cases. But for example, one of the challenges of this digital age is going to be the demand for copper or nickel and other minerals. How are we going to exploit them? With what technology so they don't harm? I mean, they're supposed to be an answer to the issues, but to the major issues going forward in climate change, for example, but how we avoid them from becoming a source of climate change is I think, a major issue. And last but not least, Ha-Joon mentioned the issue of international agreements and the policy space that countries have. I think one of the major issues going forward, on which I have very limited hope of any fruitful solution, is how we revise intellectual property rights in critical areas. I mean, we're of course in the discussion of vaccines, and apparently the exception to COVID vaccines is not going to be accepted because of the veto of some important developed countries, but also in climate change. I mean, some technologies, of course, don't have a major problem, but let's say solar panels, because they can be solved, let's say. But there may be other technologies in which intellectual property rights may be a restriction. So how do we think to the diffusion of that technology? So we have to seriously think also about the issue of intellectual property rights in relation to technologies associated with climate change.
Thank you, José Antonio. That's a really key issue, as well as the fact that industrial policy now, as you point out, has to take into account the transparency and the integrity of supply chains, which means it cannot be thought of divorced from changes at the WTO, as well as other agreements that would impact the global aspect of industrial policy. Thank you very much. Arunabha, may I call on you? How's your connection?
I hope you can hear me.
I can, yes.
Yeah. No, let me try to answer your question, Adriana, with an example. One of the things we've been looking at is how do we become energy secure without pursuing just energy independence, when we know that energy markets are actually far more interdependent than for a century, more than a century. Every country keeps saying energy independence. No one is actually energy independent. So how do you have a robust interdependence? So we looked at, new energy technologies and tried to pair it with industrial policy. So let's take solar manufacturing. We will need, for India's net zero targets, we will need 5,600 gigawatts of solar power in 2070. We have 45 gigawatts right now, right? And more than 80% of our panels have come from outside India. So how do you build that out? Similarly, if you're going to have more than 85% of vehicles being electric, how do you have a battery manufacturing ecosystem? Similarly, if you have a new hydrogen mission that we promoted, how do you bring that all in? So we've broken it down into each individual part of the supply chain or the value chain, whether it's the refining of the polysilicon, the wafer, the cell, the module, the electrode that goes into the battery that goes into the vehicle, the recycling of the minerals, or in the hydrogen case, the manufacturing of the membrane that goes into the electrolyzer that results in production of hydrogen. Then you have to store it, you have to build storage tanks, you have to transport it with pipelines or trucks, and you have end use applications. When you break it down, you obviously realize you can't do all of it. But then you also begin to see, and we've been doing the SWOT analysis of, where does India fit in this? Where does Korea fit in this? Where does Japan fit in this? And then how do you have a more integrated, interdependent supply chain where no one country is trying to do that vertically integrated, capture all of it, all of the value for yourself? So that's principle number one. Principle number two is, in this story, circular economy has to be a central theme. It can't be, well, it's some nice green entrepreneurs are circular economy entrepreneurs. No, the resource efficiency has to be absolutely central, whether it's minerals that Jose Antonio was talking about, whether it is water, whether it is land, whether it is the way the waste can be recycled and so forth. So these elements add on to the core principles that Ha-Joon was talking about earlier. My final point here is, as we think this through and we look at, therefore, how do you integrate industrial policy into a more resilient, climate resilient and economically resilient supply chain, you need at least a few new things to happen. Number one is leveraging different sources of finance that goes towards supporting these different parts of the supply chain rather than just the large industrial conglomerate right at one end. So whether it's working capital, whether it's end consumer financing, etc., that creates those markets. Second is the power of government procurement. We've talked about the resurrection of industrial policy. We've talked about the resurrection of potential new trade agreements, etc. We also have to talk about the resurrection of government procurement as a source of off-taking these new products that will come and drive down the prices, but offer the large market. And the third part, which goes back to what Jose Antonio was talking about in terms of intellectual property, how do we design and develop technologies where you're co-developing the technologies and therefore co-owning the intellectual property, rather than just expecting that the technology will be transferred, because we've seen that game and it's not played out very well, right? The vaccine manufacturers are putting their brand name on a vaccine. The vaccine is coming from a much more distributed network of pharmaceutical laboratories, government-funded pharmaceutical laboratories, small businesses or medium-sized businesses that are serving as the molecular developmental labs, whereas the brand name comes as Pfizer, AstraZeneca, or Johnson & Johnson, etc. So having a clearer intellectual property policy which focuses on co-development and co-ownership maybe then creates an opportunity to plug into the I was referring to earlier.
Thank you, Arunabha, not only for going deeper into this issue of intellectual property, which has been marked by steep inequalities, but also your reference to the budget, and I keep wondering, how can this be thought through when we have in many parts of the world, including here, some pretty severe budget drawbacks in the application of austerity measures, whether they result from political orientations or whether you have resources being channeled into more immediate responses to the pandemic crisis, which of course creates some competition with more longer term planning and resource allocation. Thank you very much. Let me go into the next guiding question, if that's okay. And then I'll ask a couple of other colleagues to answer and see if Elliott has additional follow-up questions. And here is the guiding question. So it's a great follow-up to what we have been discussing so far. What should industrial policy include beyond manufacturing, considering the global economy, and also for countries that are at different levels of development? And again, this invites us to think about linkages in the traditional sense, but also the changing relationship, for instance, between the traditional industrial sector and the service sector or agriculture. Let me ask Ha-Joon first to speak, and then Smeeeta, if that's okay, I would love to hear from you as well.
Thank you. Yes, the manufacturing has been the focus of industrial policy for good reasons. I mean, that's where technological innovation and the productivity growth that have originated from. I mean, it's a sector that is much more open to mechanization, use of the continuous chemical processes under controlled conditions. So it's natural that that sector is the kind of source of a lot of technological innovations and productivity growth. But it was, on the other hand, always a shorthand for a complex of activities. That a lot of these productive services that seem to be emerging, a lot of them used to be supplied in-house by the companies themselves. So that, in a way, I mean, what we used to call manufacturing and services were just kind of legal boundaries of the company rather than the boundaries of the interconnected activities. So we need to kind of be clear about that. There's nothing kind of wholly about the manufacturing sector itself. I mean, that can include everything from very high-tech manufacturing of the very special chemicals. I mean, when the Japan had that famous Fukushima earthquake, some specialist chemical supplies are dried up by 80% because these were produced by probably like 3 firms in the whole world. 2 of them are in Japan. So that manufacturing includes everything from that to stitching garments. So that it always has been a shorthand, but yeah, that then makes us think that we basically need to think in terms of capabilities rather than sectors. So that in the end, I mean, that some primary commodity production is very high tech. I mean, unbeknownst to most people, the Netherlands is the 2nd largest exporter of agriculture. How do they do it in such a small country with such little land? It's got one of the highest population density in the world. Basically, the Dutch industrialized the agriculture. They grow things in the greenhouses. Aquaponic agriculture, 5 shelves in one small space, stack them up, computer control feeding with the advanced chemicals, control of lighting and the humidity and everything. That's how you do high-tech agriculture. That's how you sorry, but you could produce the same tomatoes, same peppers, with the lowest possible technologies. So what we need to think about is increasing capabilities to produce, increasing the technological learning, and basically designing policies in order to do that. I mean, the final product, maybe avocado, maybe the microchips, but as far as the process of producing them is high productivity, generates new technologies, and indeed there are many examples that I try to point out. Then the sector doesn't really matter. But I mean that if you want that kind of broad rule, that manufacturing is still the source of productivity growth. That even in the US and the UK, where manufacturing sector now accounts for only about 10% of GDP, the manufacturing sector still does 60–70% of research and development. It is a lot higher in countries like Germany and Korea, which have big, well, by the standard of rich countries, big manufacturing sectors. There, 80–90% of R&D is from the manufacturing sector. So, at the broad level, manufacturing is still the key, but you have to understand that this is just the kind of the rough sketch. I mean, when you want to actually promote the activities, when you want to promote technologies, you have to forget about this, the artificial statistical boundaries, and think in terms of capabilities, complex of capabilities, rather than the final product.
Thank you, Ha-Joon. Smeeeta, it would be great to hear from you on this issue of the role of manufacturing versus other sectors. I mean, Ha-Joon just mentioned that, in fact, this complex articulation with, for instance, the service sector, agriculture has always been there. But we do know that there are some new elements. And José Antonio mentioned at the very beginning the changing nature of work, the precarization, I don't know if you say that in English, of work, right? The precarious nature of work, and how that influences that linkage. What do you see the new approach that's emerging to industrial policy as going beyond manufacturing? You're on mute again.
Sorry. Indeed, the demarcation around industrial policy is blurring beyond manufacturing, right? As we've mentioned before, services are coming in. There's also some aspect, well, we also know that mining, whether it's manufacturing or not, or whether it's considered industrial to be within the industrial policy or not. So some the demarcation is definitely not as clear-cut as one would probably hope it to be, which makes industrial policy very difficult. So let's, for example, we have all the green sectors that are coming up now. There's a lot of opportunities in green industrial policy, as we've mentioned. For example, let's take green hydrogen. It's a big up and coming topic that countries will be investing in. Many developing countries have made their intention clear that they will be in. They've got strategies for green hydrogen, etc. So I think it's a very clear example of how a country who's not yet equipped for going into a sector which is likely to be very rewarding economically, rewarding on the environment aspect, because it's the green hydrogen is the low carbon, zero carbon source of energy of the future. It will address the hard to abate industrial sectors, the need of energy for those sectors. It can help countries to export, to generate green hydrogen for export. So that's a new income source. It can help with carbon taxes increasing. We will see probably a move of high energy intensive sectors more closer to areas, regions where are able to generate and dispense those green hydrogen, right? So countries which are blessed with natural resources in the renewable energy sector, they have a clear window of opportunity here, right? We know that green hydrogen will not be possible, probably, definitely not in the next 5 years, probably the next 10 years. So countries have a clear route. They have a time to set themselves up for that. And that's where industrial policy can come in. Can this be considered industrial policy? I would argue yes. Some people would say that it's energy policy, because first you need to get sufficient renewable energy in your energy mix. So it's all blurring up, but it's exciting, and it's making the need for coordination greater among different ministries and different policies. The alignment, the coordination between policies among policies is becoming more and more important. So yes, I hope that helps.
Very much, Smeeeta. Thank you very much. I think that the task at hand is to partly to understand precisely not only where that blurring has to happen, but again, how to break down silos and enhance cooperation. Kori, I would love to hear your take on this particular part of the debate as well.
Thank you, Adriana. Well, first I would like to just footnote what Smeeeta was just saying. I really don't think we should think of energy policy as anything but a subset of industrial policies anymore. I think that the separation happens exactly for the reasons that I was explaining before, that in the case of energy for a long time, certain approaches were acceptable, but in the case of the environment, we push them to the background. And in fact, all hands need to be on deck for the transformation of production structure, and there should not be any blurring of borders there. And that takes me to my, actually, an issue that I debated whether to present under the first question, and now Ha-Joon's comments really made me want to share, which is that the fact that industrial policy or the expectations from us or our needs for the future are so multifaceted that one needs to be thinking of disruptive technology or just new technology at the same time as greening and the social effects, inclusion. And most of all, one needs to be thinking of what Ha-Joon was discussing, the fact that in fact, it's not sectors anymore, it's capabilities that we need to focus on. And what policymakers are being asked to choose, the winners that they need to choose, are investments in capabilities that will take them furthest forward, that have a chance of a path moving forward in terms of a developmental impact, but at the same time, of course, be thinking of all the other impacts that this might have. So it does begin to resemble, one can ask, but can policymakers know this much, as has been argued that it is impossible? And the answer is they have to, because in fact, they will be making decisions on where to invest when it comes to education, infrastructure, no matter what. Nothing is sector neutral. That doesn't exist. You are always choosing, okay, not any more sectors, capabilities that you're building. And that requires a fundamental change in how we build the knowledge right now with which we want to inform or help policymakers make decisions. There's no way we can be as fixated to science as we tend to be. It has to be, let us think of how managers of large private global companies make decisions about the future in investment. They don't know more about what they're deciding than policymakers necessarily know about what they are deciding. But you have to make an informed guess about the future. And that information the managers get from consulting companies, they don't go and look for scientific proof about something that has to take them, as I say, into a leap forward. And I think policymakers will be making this sort of discretionary decisions, and they need to be informed by an effort that I would like to call for, especially I think for us in the UN family. We're positioned, and it's already underway, but it's almost, for example, UNIDO has excellent case studies, but they are focused still usually on certain industries and not on others because of, I imagine, resource limitations. And the second issue is the statistics. We need to start learning and monitoring capabilities rather than only sectors. So I just wanted to use the opportunity to call for these two things because, again, as a policymaker, I wish they could get. I mean, it's more of this kind of information. And as Jose Antonio said, the World Bank is a development bank. It's also a consultancy, and we all are consultancies. But we need to build that knowledge in a fashion that can fit the very many different situations and contexts that countries are making their decisions in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kori. It's I think thinking about capabilities and capacities as opposed to starting off with sectors presents some really interesting policy, but also political challenges in terms of coordination and maybe a new mindset when it comes to policy making. I'm going to take the prerogative as moderator and actually collapse the fourth and fifth round into a single question so that we have a little bit of time for questions and answers that have been coming in through the chat. So I would like to ask, what lessons can we draw from past industrial policy successes or failures? And if any of you want to speak a little bit more about the issue of disruptive technologies, that's arisen a few times, but there's a lot of curiosity about that. So let me ask now, back to Ha-Joon and maybe Arunabha, if you can add, that would be great. And then we'll take some questions from the floor, which our colleagues have been compiling. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, lessons from the past, I mean, there are tons of them, unfortunately, the neoclassical economists have rediscovered industrial policy after 40 years of denying its existence or usefulness. So they think this is new, but there have been huge debate involving some of the older generation neoclassical economists that are like, Jagdish Bhagwati and Ian Little and so on. I mean, there have been huge debate on this in the 80s and early 90s. So we know actually that a lot of things that we didn't in the, say, 1960s and 70s, So I mean, Jose Antonio has also written a lot about this, but we first of all know that there needs to be coordination between different policies. I mean, the best industrial policy will not work if you have restrictive macroeconomic policies like they do in Brazil and South Africa. The highest real interest rate in the world, overvalued exchange rate. I mean, whatever the BNDES does, it doesn't work. We also know that the government, when implementing the policies, need to impose discipline on the recipient of government benefits. And that's what made the East Asian countries very successful. I'm not saying that they were perfect, but there was a clear expectation that when you get the protection subsidies and other government help, you will have to deliver the result. Maybe not in the next 2-3 years. I mean, that beats the whole purpose. But in 5 years, 10 years, you should be able to raise productivity, create your domestic supplier network, export more, develop your own technologies. And if you don't do that, there will be sanctions. Once again, I mean, there were corruption, so that sometimes these sanctions were not imposed, but usually they were. So that's why suspending market discipline worked, because there was an alternative disciplinary mechanism. But Peter Evans has emphasized that this the ability to impose discipline, what he called autonomy, has to be complemented by the embeddedness of the government. It has to exist that inside the social network. It has to have channels for productive compensatory the private sector. It has to take care of the issues of social cohesion. Otherwise, it becomes like the old style the Soviet planning, where you have a clear view about what the country needs to be, and then you impose it, whatever the actual outcome is. Yeah. We also know that the countries which have been pragmatic have been the most successful ones. You know, for example, take the case of Singapore. Yeah? You know, that when you read about Singapore in the standard economics books or in the financial press, you will only hear about this free trade policy and welcoming attitude towards foreign investors, which it has. But you will never be told that the Singapore government owns 90% of the land. Yeah? It supplies 85% of the housing. Yeah? It's the state-owned enterprises produce 22% of GDP. Yeah? You know, so I often challenge my graduate students: is the Singapore socialist or capitalist? Yeah? Give me one economic theory, it doesn't matter what it is, that Marxist, Austrian, neoclassical, Keynesian, that can single-handedly explain Singapore. There's no such theory. Yeah? That's how you actually make success. Yeah? And that Singapore is the most extreme example, but if you look at other most successful countries with industrial policy, you see that kind of pragmatism. Yeah? You know, the US tells others that it doesn't have industrial policy, but they had huge industrial policy. Only that it was called defense research. Yeah? And without the defense research funding, there'll be no Silicon Valley, there'll be no Apple, no Google, there'll be no IT revolution. Yeah? And they tell other people that they don't have industrial policy, but it is, I mean, apart from being the country that invented the argument for infant industry protection that was done by its first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, it is a country that had one of the biggest industrial policies after the Second World War. So, you know, the pragmatism is very much emphasized. And then, yeah, the last thing is my own kind of pet point. You know, we really need to pay more attention to design and implementation issues. Yeah? I mean, all the economic theories in the world that may justify a certain course of policy action, but if you don't have the resources, if you don't have the manpower, if you don't have the political legitimacy, if you don't have social cohesion to make that work, that's pointless. Yeah? So we need to design the policies according to the country, according to the sector. I mean, even within the same country, different sectors might have different requirements, and even according to different technologies. So once again, I mean, the granularity is very important. And I think that in a way, I mean, the fun thing about the industrial policies is that so diverse and that it's so context specific, you will never run out of research topics. Yeah?
Thank you, Ha-Joon. Thank you very much. Elliott, may I turn to you? You have such broad knowledge and experience in this matter. Are there any particular lessons that would complement Singapore, for instance?
Well, I think that's a very difficult question to answer because Singapore is so unique. But of course, as Ha-Joon pointed out, it's that mix, that balance. Now, the mix and the balance may vary from one place to another. One thing we can't forget, for example, in Singapore's case, is that there was a very clear attention paid to building up a financial infrastructure as well. You know? And I think that is something that many developing countries are going to be challenged by. And that comes back to what Jose Antonio was saying a couple of rounds ago, which is that the financing question remains critical. Because in many developing countries, the fiscal space just simply isn't there. And Ha-Joon, you mentioned very, very convincingly and eloquently that we're talking about a complex combination of capabilities. Kori, you picked up on that point and expanded upon it. And whereas before, all of the various activities associated with manufacturing were done in-house, as you said, Ha-Joon, that has been separated out, it's been changed, and it's outsourced. But what we tend not to bear in mind is that complicates tremendously the coordination question as well as the financing question. It's one thing to say you're financing the entire value chain in one big enterprise, and that was the whole question of the scale of industrialization in the past. It's quite another thing to be providing appropriate finance for the actual building of a machine somewhere, for the inputs that have to come into the machine, for the design services, for the logistical services, and all of that sort of stuff is not done centrally, can't be financed centrally, and operates at a scale that is completely different, much smaller, to the large industrial conglomerate type approach that we saw so successfully followed in many Asian countries in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. We have not yet thought through how we're going to manage that. Right? And I think that that needs to be an important corollary of industrial policy. I do not think, Jose Antonio, that the development banks have a feasible model in mind yet, because they're still thinking about development as something that governments do. And so all of their finance is aimed at providing money to the government. It's not really the government that's going to be doing the policies that are doing the activities that are going to be supported and encouraged by the industrial policy. It's the private sector. And we still have to figure out how we channel resources in a reasonable way, how we incentivize the channeling of resources by the private sector to the private sector to fund the various activities that would constitute, when put together, an industrial policy that's worthy of the name. And so I think that that is one of the challenges that we face in designing industrial policy right now. And so I would put forward here as a thought provoker that maybe industrial policy of the 21st century is no longer to be done, conceived of, or implemented only by the government. Maybe we need to have the other actors around the table in the design of the industrial policy as well. The finance sector, the technology sector, the academic community for the science and technology that's needed for the industrialization. And then we can see what role the government can most effectively play with the limited resources, financial resources it actually has. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Elliott. I see a forthcoming paper titled Multi-Stakeholder Industrial Policy in the Making. So thank you. That opened up a lot of new spaces for discussion. I would like to read to you two questions that have come up in the questions and answers. Since we're running out of time, we'll have to have very short answers, but I think they open up also really interesting questions. So from Ashish Srinivasa, we have, how can less industrialized and poor countries recover amid pandemic and post-pandemic challenges? We also have from Alessandro Motter on global value chains. I think Arunabha has partly answered this, but maybe Arunabha, you'd like to go into a little bit more detail. The question is, global value chains have led to environmental impacts, over-dependence on global markets, and now the pandemic. Shouldn't we promote local value chains instead? So if that's all right with you, Arunabha, I'd like you to address this a little bit more in depth and then open up to anyone else who would like to take on the challenge, which is very relevant to our particular committee since we deal with LDCs on how the less industrialized and poor countries can recover, including through industrial policy. Thank you.
So you want me to go first on that second question, Adriana?
Yes, please. And if you want
All
to
right.
then open up to address the second one, that's fine.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think I actually don't like this kind of 1 or 0 binary between global and local value chains. The point is to investigate where the new opportunities are rising. Let's take as an example, an emerging technology like Smeeeta referred to it, green hydrogen, right? We need green hydrogen as an industrial fuel of the 21st century. You can't make steel with solar panels, but you can make hydrogen with solar panels and then substitute that hydrogen in the shaft furnace, not the blast furnace, to manufacture steel. Now, where is the only existing steel plant making green steel using green hydrogen? In Sweden. Where is the bulk of steel production happening in the world? Is China and India. Where can you actually make hydrogen at the lowest cost using renewables? It's between the tropics, because that's where the sun shines the most. So I have counted 32 countries plus the European Union that have hydrogen policies. 24 of them have dedicated green hydrogen policies, but bulk of them are actually in Northern Europe or North America, and a little bit in the Far East, Japan and Korea, and to an extent China. Where will the bulk of demand come from? It will come from Asia. Of the dozens of sort of bilateral partnerships, etc., that have been established, there are only 7 Asian countries that are involved, 3 of which are actually oil and gas producers. So if you actually think about it, we don't right now have a platform that connects the R&D developers, the off-takers of the of the fuel, the large markets, and then the areas where you can actually manufacture all of this at very low cost. So I've actually proposed a global green hydrogen alliance that pools technical resources, financial resources, again, co-owns that intellectual property, establishes common standards for safe storage, safe transportation, so you don't create non-tariff barriers to trade, and thereby then see how does a Bolivia or a Chile fit into that value chain, right? Rather than just using them as sort of sites of extraction of minerals, how can they add some value there? Versus then you have a much more dispersed production base of the green hydrogen, and then a much more dispersed consumption base of the green hydrogen. Once we go sector by sector like this, you realize that you can actually have far greater localization, even while you have more integrated global value chains. The problem with the global value chains of the past was that the environmental challenges were not considered at all. So then you end up with this kind of negative externalities. Plus, along with that, you have mercantilist trade policies that restrict the opportunities for the latecomers to development. Opportunity now to rethink that paradigm altogether.
Thank you very much, Arunabha. Kori, would you like to add from some of the experiences that you've witnessed and worked on?
Well, it's actually a general observation. It's related to this question of what can we learn from the failures and successes as well. The European transition has been managed, and it is viewed as a success of a Washington consensus approach. Prices were gotten right, liberalization and so on. However, of course, the countries that have and are being exemplified as success stories happen to also be very on the border with the European Union, and then their members and receive massive assistance and so on. So I'm not going to get into analyzing the details, but there is one. And they also pursued industrial policies. It doesn't matter. But the fundamental observation that I want to share is that in the end, the industries, broadly speaking, not just industries, but the economic structures that they built, in each case, were not very different from the economic structures that they entered into transition with. Of course, the service sectors developed incomparably, but that's a question of really restructuring economic activities from within enterprises to their externalization. But the point is that where capabilities were built, they were not efficiently managed. Eventually, exposed to market discipline, they were validated. And my point is, so you cannot fail too much unless the lack of discipline lasts forever. The point is build capabilities and then do let the market see how best to use them. That's.
Thank you, Kori. That phrase will stay in my mind. You cannot fail too much, but I think the more important one is about the capabilities call. Thank you. Let me pass to José Antonio before we go to Elliott for closing remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Adriana. You have done a fantastic job coordinating this diverse group. Let me perhaps only add one little point, which I find important, which is, we haven't talked about, which is regional integration processes. I feel that that's a very important in many of these areas in Latin America and in Africa. In a sense, regional integration has happened through the market more in Asia. Of course, in East Asia. I think South Asia is probably a different question because there is little in terms of integration anyway. But the regional integration can play a very important role in many of the areas we have been talking about. I mean, the European Union is itself, a fantastic region. I mean, the most important regional integration process. But in Latin America, all the regional integration processes have weakened significantly or collapsed. And in Africa, they have not been born, I mean, to be sincere. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for productive development based on regional integration processes. That was my only final remark, and thanks very much, and congratulations for your, and of course for CDP for having organized, Marcia having played a very important role in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you, José Antonio. That's an absolutely essential aspect, and I'm glad that you raised it, even though we've come to the end of the event. So thank you on my behalf, certainly for to all of the speakers, and I will now pass the word to Elliott for some final words. And thank you, by the way, to those who also posed other questions. We didn't have time, but they are well received by our panelists, and they will be food for thought also for our committee.
Thank you very much, Adriana. And let me start off by thanking you again for some really superb moderation, as José Antonio has said. And I thank all of the panelists as well. I can say without any fear of contradicting myself that I've seldom been so intrigued by a discussion or so well educated at the end of it. And so what I have to say is it's just going to scratch the very surface of it all, but it pertains to one particular aspect. We generally think of industrial policy as something that nations do on their own. It's a national endeavor, yeah? But we live in an interconnected world, and that theme has come through in the discussion for the past hour and a half. Most countries are facing a challenge in formulating a post-pandemic industrial policy that will have to enable the decarbonization. It'll have to be driven by digitalization, as pointed out. It will generally be much more decentralized in terms of the production structures than they used to be maybe 20 or 30 years ago. And it will also have to be contributing towards an economic structure that is not only low carbon, but also resource efficient while remaining competitiveness. We've, I think, agreed that an approach to industrial policy is unlikely to succeed in the present context if we think of it as a purely sectoral affair. It is more about that complex interplay of different capabilities, and we discussed that at length, the challenges that poses. But from that context, if we accept that technology and finance are enablers, they can also be seen as potential constraints. And that is where I think industrial policy has to be situated within the global context and has to be supported by the global community. Because it is through that kind of international cooperation that we'll be able to address some of the issues of the questions of sustainable and carbon neutral technologies and materials being brought into the production system in countries that perhaps do not have full access to them. That means creating, as Arunabha just suggested, platforms that can bring together the various elements of a global value chain, but allow at the same time for the localized industrial policy or the localized development of productive capacities that we need to have given the structure of many of our economies. It means also scaling up some of the attempts to overcome the barriers that might exist that inhibit this kind of cooperation. And that cooperation is really needed when we talk about the greening of industrial policy in particular, because it has to facilitate the investment in climate-friendly, sustainable types of productive activities and infrastructure as well. And innovative technologies, the transfer of these innovative technologies won't happen the way it did in the past through direct foreign investment. It'll have to be through the design of mechanisms that will enable, let's say, a more flexible approach to intellectual property rights. So I think we see many different areas where industrial policy will have to evolve further than it has done before. But I think we can't exclude the fact that we need to spend a lot of time thinking about how we can come together as a global community to support industrial policy without having that sense that we're somehow treading into taboo type areas or doing things that we really shouldn't be doing. I think this is the one way in which we can make sure that everyone, every country participates fully in our global economy, and that participation is consistent with our objectives for sustainability and environmental protection, as well as social equality and justice. So I want to again thank all the panelists. I thank the CDP for supporting this, and I must express my gratitude to my colleagues in DESA and in UNIDO for the excellent work in organizing it all. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And thank you to Marcia. I don't know, I
Yes.
don't see her, but thank you because she was the organizer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, you did a
That's
great
it. Thank you
job.
so much.
Now I see Marcia. Thank you.
Obrigada, Márcia. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Eu que agradeço. Thank you so much, Adriana. Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay, thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Bye then.
Bye.
Talk
Bye.
soon. Ciao, ciao.
Bye.